Could you say a little about your journey with, in terms of understanding childhood trauma, and how that developed and how that's different from adult trauma?
Well, the way we got into trauma was during the war, from the war, and it's an American phenomenon. PTSD was defined by us because we followed up the Brits as being the most belligerent country in the world. Like you guys used to have that record, now we have it. Now the Russians are vying for it. And so we dealt with a lot of adults. And then I went back to my old teaching hospital and became, as a psychopharmacologist, I saw all these people with terrible childhood trauma. It's very clear they had somewhat different issues, and the issues were much more pervasive, and so pervasive the whole personality and mental developments. And then we learned a lot about the brain and how the brain gets affected by early trauma. And so the big issue actually that out there, our various professional organizations still talk about trauma as, oh, that's that event. But for very few people, it's that event. For most people, it is those relationships, that series of events, that family I grew up with. That's a much more pervasive, long-term developmental issue. But I've written numerous research articles on that, shown how it's different, hasn't made a damn bit of difference. Still, complex PTSD or developmental trauma still is not in the textbooks, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the things I wanted to ask you. Why is there such a resistance?
You should ask the people who resist. Don't ask the guy who comes up with the data. Like, you know.
But I mean, do you think, because sometimes I wonder, in the UK, there's an enormous resistance to acknowledging the importance of early years. So the early years funding is increasingly cut. So there's less and less support for parents, deprived parents, there's less and less support for younger kids. And sometimes I wonder, is it related on some level to how disconnected the average British politician is
Well,
from their own pain?
no, I think the UK is in a unique condition in that the rest of the world may rank British moms as the worst moms in the world, who send their kids off to boarding schools and get the little buggers out of there. Winston Churchill is a great example, you know, sends off to boarding school at age 6 so his mom can have her lovers. He writes to mom, I'm going home for 4 days for Christmas. Will you please spend some time with me?
Oh.
Look, you know, and that's the British tradition, is to send kids off to be traumatized in boarding schools. And what resulted in that the Brits are the greatest attachment researchers in the world. Because for them, attachment is like, oh, there's people, they play with their children. What's that about? Like,
Yes.
you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
so you have I don't know any culture in the world that is more child phobic than your upper class British world, you know, like it's quite stunning. So I imagine that tradition continues. And once you go through that, you go like, it didn't hurt me. I'm great. So other people can be great too. There's no problem at all. Like, you know,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then we don't need to fund all of these programs that would support these struggling parents and so on. And it kind of has this knock-on effect. And then the psychiatrists are also somehow involved in the system. And then
Yeah.
I guess I'm just curious whether you feel like there is some degree of kind of internal difficulty in acknowledging it, because it means one acknowledging their own
I've
childhood.
certainly been impressed. It is tough in the United States. It may be even tougher in the UK. I've twice given the keynote lecture to the Royal College of Psychiatrists, and both times I got a very polite applause before people filed out and did not ask any questions, which is very unusual. Actually, most places I go to, people are filled with questions and examples and resonances. But in the UK, I meet a lot of like, hey, this is very nice. Like,
Yeah. And are there other, I mean, I guess traveling around the world, you've seen all sorts of different cultural approaches to trauma and
yeah.
manifestations. I mean, are there any
Well,
others?
that's been actually one of the great parts of my growth and development, is to go to a place like China, when it's still sort of Mao times, and seeing all these Chinese doing Qigong in the parks. And I go, why the hell are these people not talking to their therapist? But instead in the park doing these weird gestures. And I make these weird gestures with people in the park. And I go like, wow, that's why people do it. It's a really very tough place to live. But when you do that, you feel so much better. And then you go to Africa, and I spent a fair amount of time with Bishop Tutu back then. And he was singing and dancing with people, and they were drumming and making music. And I go like, wow, these people know some stuff that I didn't know. And they seem to really recover themselves and do so much better. So what I became aware of that, people always get traumatized everywhere in every culture in the world. So that means also that every culture has found ways of dealing with that. Nobody's found it perfectly, but like people in India do yoga. I happen to have studied yoga through the National Institute of Health. I did serious research, and it turns out that yoga is a very effective treatment for trauma. And I haven't studied drumming, but some people have, and drumming can be very helpful. And so movements, one of the study, I always say to people, if you happen to have a trust fund and have an extra $1 million lying around, I'd love to do a study comparing tango dancing with cognitive behavioral therapy. I'm a scientist, so I'm neutral to see what it will, but I would put my bet on tango dancing.
Yeah.
The other example is boxing. Nelson Mandela told me that boxing was the single most important reason why he became such a saint-like person. I go like, wow, I wouldn't have thought about that. So I'm very grateful that I have had so many opportunities to really see what people do in different parts of the world and see like, you guys have figured something out that I didn't know.
Yeah. I was remembering a New York Times article I read where someone was being interviewed in Rwanda after the genocide.
Yeah.
And they were saying to the journalist, we didn't really understand what happened. All these white people arrived and they started to put us into little rooms and make us talk about all the horrible things that had happened to us.
Yeah.
There was no singing together, no dancing together, no being in community. And I never forgot it because it felt like, gosh, what is happening? That's what we're all thinking is helpful.
Yeah.
Have someone sit there on their own.
I'm going to Rwanda in December, and I'm very much looking forward to learning from them what they did.
Yeah. And so I know that we're short of time, and I want to make sure I ask some of these questions. In terms of your work and your relationship with your work, what is it that you really love about it?
Everything, exploring, trying out new things, seeing people get better, seeing unexpected results. That's why I wrote my book. The reason why I wrote my book is that I've been on the admissions committee at various medical schools here in Boston, and I always ask the applicants for the residency, what book have you read that has most inspired you to become a psychiatrist? And the last 15 years, none of the applicants had a book they had read that they could cite, except for the DSM. And so I thought, I'm going to write a book that after you read it, you go like, this is the most interesting thing in the world. I want to do this for a living. Brain, society, development, what have you. I'm sort of a multilingual person. And if you want to speak many languages at once, study trauma, because there's so many different aspects to it. Body movement, brains, development. It's great.
And so your book has been one of the top New York Times bestsellers for the last 3 years, hasn't it?
Yeah, basically since the beginning.
Yeah. So why do you think it's been
you
so?
should ask them.
I mean, I have my ideas because it is
your ideas as good as mine.
Engaging, but I mean, it captured something. You were able to put something into words that really spoke to people.
Yeah. Nobody expected it. Most of all, Penguin UK. After my book came out, they were not doing anything to advertise it. And I wrote to them and said, there's no publicity for this book whatsoever. And if you do, I wrote to them and said, you'll probably be able to sell 50,000 books. And they wrote back to me, only Ian McEwan sells 50,000 books. And half a year later, I sold 50,000 books in the UK. And they wrote to me, So what do you make of that? You sold 50,000 books in the UK. I said, you bought a book, you should know where it is, not me. Like, I just wrote a book. I didn't buy it.
Well, I see it in my local bookshop, right out there in front
Yeah.
with all the others.
Yeah.
I mean, it's wonderful.
But may be important. That's my own take on it, or because my own subjective reaction is that both the UK and the US in the past few years has some very crazy leaders, and it was a little bit like living in an abusive family, where dad is completely out of control, and the parents say, "Oh no, dad is just fine. There's nothing going on. This is not really happening." And this is like what it's like to grow up in an abusive family. Is that we certainly in the US, I don't know quite what it's like to live in the UK in that regard, but in the US, we had an extremely dangerous, frightening, horrible leader. And I think it brought back for many people what it's like to grow up in a family where you can't feel safe. That's just my take on it, but I don't know.
Yeah, yeah. And I think maybe it coincided with just there being such an epidemic in mental health issues. Certainly.
I don't think the epidemic had a lot to do with it. Except, no,
I don't mean the pandemic. I don't
Yeah.
mean Corona.
Oh.
I mean more just such an increase in desperation around depression and anxiety. And
See, I don't know about it either, like I actually am sort of a serious student of history, and I think life has never been so good as it has been in Europe and the US for the majority of people in history. Actually, we live in the best moment of history in terms of, go back to Dickens' time, what it must have been like to work in the mines in England. Like those people had a lot to be complained about. So objectively, our world is a lot better than it was back then. But that's part of what allows people to go into trauma is when you know what it's like to feel safe, when you know the contrast. When you live in the middle of trauma, you don't see it because that's what life is. For example, I have a friend, a colleague, who is a major Russian scientist, really like Nobel Prize level person, and he says to me, "There's no trauma in Russia." And I go, "Oh, I didn't know that." If there's so much trauma, you can't see it because life just sucks.
yeah.
And you don't know that there's alternatives in a way.
Yeah, and I was remembering something you said in a Guardian interview about not overusing the word trauma as well.
Yeah.
That we reduce its significance when we do that. And
yeah, I think the pandemic is a very good example. Most journalists who interview me say, "So, Dr. Van der Kolk, tell me about the collective trauma of the pandemic." And I go, "It is not a collective trauma. It was an inconvenience for me. It wasn't fun. As opposed to those nurses who had to take care of people who were choking to death and who had no relatives come. For them, it was traumatic. Not for me. For my grandchildren who spent a lot of time with their parents, it wasn't traumatic at all. They had a lot of fun together. For my students who were 21 years old, it was horrible because when you're 21, you're supposed to date and go to parties and figure out who you are. And for 21 to be locked up and not being able to make contact with people is terrible. For a person like me, I have plenty of people who I can talk to, so it's no big deal.
Yeah. So it's underused in some areas and overused in other areas. Yeah. I guess that's partly, to do with people not fully understanding what it is.
Well, I think what's really going on, I just came from a webcast with the governor of one of the states in the US, and they kept talking about what happens out there. And in fact, the issue is what happens in people's families, the issue of domestic violence. And so many people have history of domestic violence that they hate to open up those wounds. And to really, when you really realize that at least a third of all couples at some point in their relationship engage in physical violence, how pervasive that is. You know, and it's much easier to talk about, oh, there's immigrants over there, or there's people from a different religion over there. No, the problem is that we have a very hard time negotiating safe relationships ourselves. And to face that takes a lot of courage, actually.
Yeah, yeah. And another thing I was struck about in your book was the story about the I think his name was Tom at the beginning, the Vietnam soldier who was involved in a horrible incident, and the next day went and committed various atrocities in a village. And you know, it struck me that direct, you know, as we would imagine it to be, correlation between one experiencing trauma and then being a perpetrator.
As my friend Sandy Bloom says, hurt people hurt people.
Yeah.
And so if you're filled with anger and rage and neglect, it's hard to be kind to other people.
Yeah. But there's little understanding about that, I think, or compassion towards that from government.
Luckily there is an increased awareness of it. You know, we can talk about how little awareness there is, but compared with when we first formulated the PTSD diagnosis in 1980, we said in the preamble, this is an extraordinary event outside of the usual realm of human experience. It is very common. 90% of all prisoners have horrendous trauma histories. And we're beginning to know that, It takes a long time, but I think people are much more aware of the impact of trauma, in part because of people like Judy Herman's book and Vince Folletti's CDC study, that people are good, oh, it's real and it happens a lot. So we can moan about how much more awareness there should be, but we all already have seen big changes in 30 years, actually. Yeah.
And you set up the Trauma Research Foundation. What kinds of initiatives are you involved in now?
What we do, we are mainly involved in demonstrating innovative treatments, in part because when I was on the research end of things, that's what the Trauma Center mainly did, is it was impossible to get funding for anything interesting. And so we kept getting stuck because you cannot get money for new things. And what we do as the Trauma Research Foundation, we fund research in theater groups. We have big funding on the study of touch in trauma. We're funding a major initiative in neurofeedback. So we're trying to support innovative treatments at this point and get enough evidence that people cannot dismiss it as irrelevant, but really that we come up with the data to show how effective it might be.
So with touch, for example, I'm a somatic experiencing practitioner, so we use touch quite a lot. And I, you know, have experienced for myself also how intense the healing it can be. But how might you see that being incorporated, assuming that the research shows that it's really effective? How might that be able to be?
I would see that every clinic, inpatient unit, has a body worker or two. And that people really take it very seriously, that if you have an untouched body and if you become terrified of touch, you become terrified of one of the most potentially consoling things in the world. And if you're afraid of the sensation in your own body, I mean, this is sort of almost, I can say it as a dogma, like I believe this will be true 500 years from now, that if you cannot feel the pleasure of touch, you cannot feel the pleasure of life. And so as long as you run away from your internal sensations, you cannot get better. Telling trauma stories is not going to make you feel better. Feeling safe in your body is going to make you feel better. And so I think our disciplines, psychology, psychiatry, social work, are way behind on opening themselves up for the body. And again, I see an increased awareness, beginning awareness in the US, on the East Coast and West Coast in particular, about the need for somatic therapies. And that may be coming in the UK also. But that is really, the Western idea is what we should do. We should talk and explain. And it's good to talk, but understanding why you messed up does not stop you being you messed up. You have to have an experience that say, oh, now I know what it feels like to feel safe. Now I know what it feels like to feel in my body. And so you need to do much more experience and less finger wagging.
Yeah. And I guess also in certain practices, like you were saying, the Qigong or dance or whatever it may be with other people, trauma can be processed without it being explicitly processed.
That's
Can't
right.
it? It can be healed.
But you know, but we see when we organize conferences where we do these things, the most traumatized people don't engage. We're involved in a lot of theater practices, and kids are just loving it, having a great time. And the kids who are not that bad off can engage, but the most abused kids stand by the side and don't dare to engage. So then our job becomes, how do you make it possible for people to experience their bodies safely? It's a big challenge.
How can you say a little more?
Our next book is called Come to Your Senses, which I think will probably not do very well at all, because it really requires that people pay attention to their bodies. It's a workbook on how to get in touch with your body. And my wife is a body worker and a musician, and we teach workshops on how to do it, or she more than I, because she's a more embodied person than I am.
And you know, what are some of the ways that children in that situation could be worked with, either therapeutically or, you know, through education systems? I mean, how can some of the children that are really struggling?
I show movies about people tossing beach balls, and I always say, before you clean your balls, get a beach ball. Just toss a ball. Get in sync. Work with rhythms. Basically, our sense of joy as a human being comes from being in sync with other people. If you and I really are in sync with each other, we leave this interview with like, wow, that was a cool interview. And if we are out of sync with each other, you go like, that's a sort of a waste of time. And so you're nodding as I'm talking. So thank you very much for nodding, because it gives me a sense that you are somewhat in tune with me. And so the issue of being a child is your environment, and you need to dance together, need to move together, need to sing together. You may complain about state of affairs in UK, but the greatest researcher in this regard is right in Edinburgh, is called Wintervarthen, who most mental health workers have never heard about. And you should, because he's done spectacular work, as have many other people, on the power of rhythms, voice, movement, song, which is really the foundation of who we are. And so how do you work with kids? You work with kids the way you work with kids, like through movement and sound.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of brings me back to also feeling that if parents are supported, then they can also engage in various ways with their own children. But if they're not supported, it's very difficult, you know.
And you know, a lot of parents are traumatized, and they may be extremely dedicated to doing well by their kids, and be very uptight about it, because they have to do it right. And so helping people actively to be free to play with their kids and be with their kids, terribly important. Yeah.
So we're just almost out of time, and I wanted to ask you what you thought of Benjamin Fry's book, The Invisible Lion, if you've read it.
Yeah, that's a question that I haven't really vetted that carefully. I leafed through it and said, okay, yeah, good. But so I think you should just include this in the interview. Benjamin will feel terrible if he would hear that. Yeah.
But tell me a little about.
I love Benjamin, actually.
Yes, tell me about how you know Benjamin and what your relationship with him is like, and where your work crosses over, if it does.
I forgot where I met Benjamin, but he kept showing up in one place after another, and so we slowly got to talk and be in various exotic places, and he did some psychodrama with me, and so he just became part of the world. And he's on our board of directors, and I've consulted with him about Kieran House. So yeah, so one of these evolutions of a friendship that happens.
Yeah. Okay, great. I know you're busy and you have to go off, but it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
And I look forward to your next book and to hearing more.
Good. Yeah, you can just leaf through the book and do the same thing as. All right.
That was great.
Good talking with you. Okay.
Bye, Bessel. Thank you. Bye.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.